I'm Dr. Gerald Cleaver of the Physics Department here at Baylor, and I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Ian Hutchinson, who's going to give his talk on scientism and the technological fix. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Hutchinson. He is a professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT. He's also involved in the Alcator project. He's co-principal, the Plasma Science and Fusion Center at MIT. Dr. Hutchinson received his BA in physics at Cambridge University, his PhD in engineering physics at the Australian National University. He's, as I said, professor of nuclear science and engineering at MIT. His primary research interest is plasma physics, especially the magnetic confinement of plasmas. He and his MIT designed, built, and operate the Alcator C-mode tokamak, an international experimental facility whose magnetically confined plasmas reach temperatures beyond 50 million degrees Celsius. His personal scientific contributions span many areas of plasma physics. He's written over 160 journal articles in on a variety of plasma physics. His present personal research interests include plasma momentum transport, MHD instability. He's a fellow of the American Scientific Society of the Institute of Physics. He's the author of related computer software widely used for web publishing. He's written and spoken widely on a relationship between science and Christian faith. He is also an enthusiastic fly fisherman, squash player, and choral singer. I'd like to introduce him.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here. I want to thank Darren Davis for making this possible, and thanks to all of the team, especially Vicky Schultz, who's helped me with my travel, and to everyone who's made this possible. Since we've had some discussion of scientism already today, I thought I'd begin, before I get into my talk proper, by just talking about what I mean by scientism. What I mean by scientism is spelt out in great detail in the book that I published last year called Monopolizing Knowledge. And I have a specific definition of what I mean by scientism. I mean the erroneous belief that all of the real knowledge there is science. This is not synonymous with materialism or physicalism, and it's not synonymous with technicism. So I wanted to draw out that definition just in the light of the discussion we've had already, because that will make more sense of my talk as we move forward. And I want to give you my thoughts about the relationship between scientism, as I've just described it, and what I've called the technological fix, which could be interpreted, if you like, as being the technicism that we're all here thinking about and trying to understand better and develop Christian perspectives about. Scientists around about the turn of the 20th century not infrequently remarked on the purity of their intellectual activity and the improbability of its ever having practical use. Concerning the splitting of the nucleus, Rutherford happily commented that the idea of power from nuclear transmutation was talking moonshine. How wrong he was. By this sort of a move, the scientists of that day distinguished themselves from the engineers who had devised the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution. Today, by contrast, both applied scientists like me, who far outnumber the pure scientists, and the engineers themselves are happy that their work has practical application. But they're rarely willing to take direct responsibility for the results. Perceived societal need does drive some choices of research topic, particularly government-sponsored research. Nevertheless, the prevailing viewpoint, I suggest to you, is that with technology, what can be done will be done, and the repercussions for society, beyond those of a rather direct consideration of technical safety, are not, in a certain sense, the technologists' main worry. In effect, an attitude like that reflects an underlying belief that science and even perhaps technology are value neutral, that they are just about objective facts, that they depend just on scientific evidence. Science still sometimes tries to portray itself in the neutral, pure way of Rutherford as the purveyor of a natural knowledge independent of technology. Technologists, not possessing the same level of plausible deniability, nevertheless routinely speak of innovation as a self-evident good in itself, preferring to presume innovation's human benefit rather than to admit the force of a much more ambiguous technological compulsion. Science, and I mean natural science, is actually inseparably entwined with technology, and it has been throughout its history. This is because science, as, for example, Francis Bacon advocated it, is precisely the kind of practical knowledge that gives rise to technology. Science studies the world insofar as it is reproducible in its response to repeated experiment and observation, and can be described with a certain clarity that is provided by measurements, systematization, mathematics, and so on. And technology requires that the world respond to the application of controlling and manipulating influences in just such a reliable and reproducible way. So science supports and gives rise to technology. But the opposite is also true. Technology supports and gives rise to science. It supports it in part because technology is the most convincing demonstration of the reality of scientific knowledge. Science is persuasive in the modern world not because of some theoretical arguments that shows it has particular methods or approaches that are guaranteed to yield objective knowledge, but instead because it gives rise to understanding that works. Nothing so convincingly demonstrates human understanding of incompressible fluid dynamics, for example, as to fly in a Boeing 747. A laser pointer that can shine with exquisite focus for hundreds of meters is a palpable demonstration that we really understand light and quantum mechanics. There's no more convincing proof of our understanding of bacterial diseases than to experience the dramatic cure by an antibiotic of an otherwise fatal infection. No intellectual argument, in other words, has anything like the impact of useful technology. Technology also supports and gives rise to science because it provides the tools that enable scientific progress. Galileo made his name as a scientist and made the case for the Copernican solar system, not by his world-leading understanding of dynamics, profound though that was, but by being an early adopter of the latest technology, the telescope. He didn't invent it, but he did construct telescopes that outstripped the power of any others of the day, and he was the first to turn them on the heavens and interpret what he saw in physical terms. The leading edge of today's astronomical and cosmological knowledge is likewise completely dependent on technology. For example, the power of spaceflight to place in orbit above the obscuring blanket of the atmosphere telescopes that can detect not only light but also ultraviolet radiation, X-rays, and gamma rays. Thus, even the least applied of subjects, for example, astronomy, has always depended upon technology for its progress. I was at a conference over 20 years ago now that was organized by the Association for Religion and Intellectual Life. And I gave a talk there which was extremely critical of scientism and the technological culture. I argued that Christianity had to some extent experienced a kind of failure of nerve in the face of the enormous growth and success of science, but that it didn't need to do so. I argued that scientism, the belief that science is all the real knowledge there is an unjustified extrapolation of science's undoubted success and power in its chosen topical area, namely the behavior of the world insofar as it is reproducible and possesses clarity. And I advocated the value, meaning, and significance of non-scientific knowledge, including religious knowledge. In other words, my talk was a repudiation of scientism. Imagine my surprise then when, during the question time at that conference, in addition to voices affirming some things that I'd said, especially about the environment, I faced an onslaught of critical comments focused on the fact that I had asserted that science was successful and powerful. I had walked into a postmodern buzzsaw. It was unacceptable to many of those academics and scholars to talk as if science were successful or had some specific knowledge of the world. They had signed on to a postmodern critique that not only asserts the importance of non-scientific knowledge, which I had asserted, but also denies that science has any truly objective knowledge, even in its own topics of study. Now, there had been, of course, many critiques of scientism well before it became a celebrated target of postmodern attack. The early 19th century Romantics, poets, for example, such as Wordsworth or Coleridge, had offered a totally different approach to what they undoubtedly thought of as the study of nature. It was the Romantic approach, contrasting with excessively impersonal and objectivized activities, as they saw it, of the scientists. Somewhat later, perhaps, the most celebrated critiques from within Christian intellectual circles of the excessive reliance upon science in the mid-20th century came from C.S. Lewis and the literary and philosophical thinkers whom he came to represent. Lewis's Ransom trilogy, the science fiction trilogy, Out of the Silent Planet, etc., and his directly philosophical books such as The Abolition of Man, indict a narrow, naturalistic vision of humanity and the consequent technological domination of society. Now, I'm an enormous fan of Lewis. I've derived major fractions of my understanding of the relationship of the Christian faith to the intellect from his luminous writing. Yet, his writing on scientism, for me, is not his most successful. And the reason, I think, is that he shows little appreciation of what I see as the compelling intellectual power of science. And this is perhaps, of course, because he was no scientist. And what's more, he makes no strong distinction between science and scientism. So, for example, he uses the word scientism no more than once or twice in his entire corpus, and to my recollection, he had no stable substitute to refer to the unwarranted extension of scientific approach to all of knowledge, which is what, in a certain sense, he was trying to criticize. So even though his critique is deep and thoughtful, and his advocacy of the breadth of human experience and understanding is powerfully framed, to a scientist, it can sound a little bit like a lack of appreciation of science's strength and value. It can sometimes sound a little like partisanship, just as I think can those criticisms that I faced at that conference by Eril. So I thought after that Eril conference, the Association of Religion and Intellectual Life conference experience, and I think now that the postmodern critique of scientism, like many that came before it, is fully justified in rejecting the pretensions of scientism to monopolize knowledge. But I also think that the critique is unjustified in rejecting scientism's claim to know the natural world. Science's claim to know the natural world. Not everything in our lives has the properties that enable science to comprehend it. In that sense, not everything is nature. Many of the human and social academic disciplines are concerned with topics that simply require different approaches to knowledge and understanding, I would argue. Scientism, by presupposing that the methods of the natural sciences are the only reliable way to knowledge, compromises and distorts and undermines vast domains of human thought, including, but not limited to, religion. But postmodernism's weakness in addressing scientism is that it fails to distinguish science from scientism. And for a scientist like me, that failure amounts to throwing out the baby, science, with the bathwater, scientism. Now, if repudiating scientism requires repudiating science, then I, for one, would not sign on to it. But it doesn't. Science and scientism are different and distinguishable. One is our way of finding out about the natural world, by which I mean, again, those aspects of the world which display the characteristics of science, and that science assumes and addresses. The other, scientism, inflates natural knowledge into a dogmatic metaphysical worldview. Technology provokes an extended or parallel critique. Scientism claims to represent the one valid way to obtain knowledge, and it is a kind of extension of the methods of the scientific revolution to all of human understanding. Its critics, explicit or implicit, deny that monopoly of knowledge and affirm a much broader understanding of what constitutes knowledge. But in parallel to that has grown up a critique that is aimed not so much at the epistemology, how we know what we know, as the social outcome. And this is the critique of technology. From the 18th century onward, the advance of technology has been criticized and resisted, not just because of its topics and attitudes, but because of the injustice of its consequences. So the Luddites, for example, thought that power looms were the next step in the impoverishment of the working classes by the Industrial Revolution, and they set about to break into the factories and destroy those looms. And their name became attached to the supposed irrational rejection of technology. And you know, the charge of irrationality became entrenched in all of the arguments about the adoption of technology, even till today. And yet, it's far from obvious that resistance to new technology is usually irrational. Dr. Deneen cited to us last night the example of the old Amish who reject technology. It's not at all the case that they do so on the basis of irrationality. They've thought about it very carefully. Rather, in the West, we seem to have gone to the other extreme and abdicated the moral evaluation of technology, instead, de facto, relying purely on economic factors to determine technology's acceptance or rejection. Sustained intellectual critiques of the predominance of technology in the 20th century can be illustrated by Jacques Ellul's La Technique from 1954, and almost 40 years later, Neil Postman's Technopoly, The Surrender of Culture to Technology. Despite widespread critical acclaim for these works, they actually seem to have had rather little obvious influence on our society's domination of culture by technology. And by the way, I will occasionally use the word technopoly as a convenient, broad reference to the domination of culture by technology, even though Ellul didn't use that word at all, and Postman used it to mean something a little bit narrower than what I do. So excuse me on that, in that imprecision. Just as science and technology are inextricably linked, and neither can be rightly called the parent of the other, I refrain from identifying scientism as either the parent or the child of technopoly. A more accurate metaphor, I think, might be to regard them as mutually supportive siblings. So I see scientism as the broad intellectual foundation of technopoly. So from the perspective of Postman and Ellul and other technology critics, scientism might be considered to be theoretical technopoly. From my perspective, technology is applied scientism. And in my book, I aim more at examining and understanding that theoretical underpinning of the technological domination of modern society, rather than setting forth the empirical results, which is what Postman and Ellul mostly do. It may seem now that technique is in practice sufficiently automatic, sufficiently self-propelled, that it needs no theoretical justification. And yet theories have consequences. And I believe that if we understand scientism, we have the intellectual equipment to contradict and undermine technopoly's foundations. But let me spend a few moments just setting forth the critiques of Ellul and Postman. Developments since the Industrial Revolution, according to Ellul, have led to a new and overwhelming culture of technique that possesses 5 characteristics, he says. The first he dubs automatism, by which he means the technical movement becomes self-directing towards the most efficient methods. He says, the human being is no longer in any sense the agent of choice. Everything that is not technique is being eliminated. The challenge to a country, an individual, or a system is solely a technical challenge. Ellul's second characteristic he calls, in translation at any rate, self-augmentation, with the result that in a given civilization, technical progress is irreversible, and technical progress tends to act not according to an arithmetic, but according to a geometric progression. And then technique in its development poses primarily technical problems, which consequently can only be resolved by technique. The third characteristic is translated monism, by which Ellul means that it ought never to be said on the one side technique, on the other the abuse of it, or all techniques are inseparably united. No, he says, technology doesn't evolve with any end in view of human good. He says, quote, it evolves in a purely causal way. The combination of previous elements furnishes the new technical elements. There is no purpose or plan that is being progressively realized. Self-augmentation and monism combine to provide the fourth characteristic, the necessary linking together of techniques, by which organizational technique of necessity emerges from prior techniques and comes to dominate economics, commerce, society, and the state through military, police, administration, and politics. And finally, we arrive at the fifth characteristic, technical universalism, whereby technology spreads to all geographic regions and subverts all cultures until it has taken over the whole of civilization. And together this leads to a self-sufficiency of technique that constitutes the usurpation of humankind's highest aspirations. Quote, since technique has put itself beyond good and evil, it need fear no limitation whatever. It was long claimed that technique was neutral. Today this is no longer a useful distinction. The power and autonomy of technique are so well secured that it, in its turn, has become the judge of what is moral, the creator of a new morality. In our technical age, everything today seems to happen as though ends disappear as the result of the magnitude of the very means at our disposal. And though comprehending that the proliferation of means brings about the disappearance of ends, we have become preoccupied with rediscovering a purpose or a goal. But as far as Ellul is concerned, that is merely a pious hope with no chance whatsoever of influencing technical evolution. So Jacques Ellul, quite remarkably, offers no solution or any hope for one. Neil Postman's brought somewhat later, as I mentioned, brought to fore the word technopoly, which he distinguishes from the more familiar technocracy as follows. Culture was in the state of technocracy when, quote, two opposing worldviews, the technological and the traditional, coexisted in uneasy tension. But with the rise of technopoly, one of those thought worlds disappears, and technopoly eliminates alternatives to itself. It makes them invisible and therefore irrelevant. And it does so by redefining what we mean by religion, by art, by family, by politics, by history, by truth, by privacy, by intelligence, so that our definitions fit its new requirements. Technopoly, in other words, is totalitarian technology, according to Neil Postman. And this description parallels in the technical realm what I call scientism with respect to science. Postman and Ellul both perceive a degree of compulsion in technology that goes beyond the intellectual and beyond science. So just to be specific, Postman summarizes his view of scientism in this way. He says, it is not merely the misapplication of techniques such as quantification to questions where numbers have nothing to say, not merely the confusion of the material and social realms of human experience, not merely the claim of social researchers to be applying the aims and procedures of natural science to the human world. Scientism is all of these, he says, but something profoundly more. It is the desperate hope and wish and ultimately the illusory belief that some standardized set of procedures called science can provide us with an unimpeachable source of moral authority, a supra-human basis for answers to questions like what is life and when and why. Unlike Ellul, Postman offers two ideas for how to resist and correct technopoly. They are to be a loving resistance fighter and to reform education. Now, Postman thinks that America is the only country so far to have succumbed to technopoly, although he was writing in the early 1990s, so maybe if he were writing today, he would agree that others have succumbed. But anyway, he says that to be a loving freedom fighter, you must always keep close to your heart the narrative and symbols that once made the United States the hope of the world. And his resistance is expressed in aphoristic traits. So the freedom fighters are those, for example, who refuse to accept efficiency as the preeminent goal of human relations, refuse to allow psychology or any social science to preempt the language and thought of common sense. They take the great narratives of religion seriously and do not believe that science is the only system of thought capable of producing truth. They are those who admire technological ingenuity, but do not think it represents the highest possible form of human achievement. His second suggestion or proposal is educational reform, and his reformed educational curriculum content, quote, must join art and science, but we must also join the past and the present, so that all subjects are presented as a stage in humanity's historical development, in which the philosophies of science, of history, of language, of technology, and of religion are taught, and in which there is a strong emphasis on classical forms of artistic expression. Now, I agree with Postman in these objectives, but I think the problem is that his cultural resources are insufficient to achieve them. And I'm going to return to that point later. But first, let me talk about the technological fix. A society dominated by scientism is a society that looks first, and sometimes only, for a technological fix for every challenge that confronts it. And this is the greatest distorting perspective. The truth is that most of the problems of society in the 21st century are, just as they have been for millennia, more human challenges than technological challenges. Yet a reductive viewpoint of scientism and a narrow focus on technology as the sole source of answers to problems dominates our public discussion. My research field is the field of nuclear science and engineering. It has a major focus on energy, which is seen today as a signature challenge for this century, to be addressed primarily by technology. I've worked most of my career at research that is aimed at making nuclear fusion, the energy source of the stars, available on a human scale. And on the left-hand side of this view graph, you see the toroidal plasma confinement device that we've built at MIT, which is a scale model of a much bigger experiment that's currently under construction in the south of France called ITER. And on the right-hand side of this view graph is a wide-angle fisheye photograph of that plasma. And actually, one of the interesting things about it is you're looking into this donut-shaped toroidal plasma, and you see almost nothing, almost no light in the middle of the plasma. And the reason is that the center of the plasma is so hot that it no longer radiates any visible light. It only radiates X-rays, very high-energy photons. And so you only see light around the edge of the plasma. The center of our plasma is hotter than the center of the sun. It's confined using magnetic fields. I don't want to get embroiled just now in the politically fraught arguments about global climate change and what, if anything, to do about it, although I will comment that the scientific evidence for substantial human contributions to recent global warming are becoming stronger year by year. But instead, I want to make a much broader point. When Westerners think about energy and the environment, most often the question they're asking is something like, what technologies are going to contribute to solving the problem? In other words, they're looking for what I would call the technological fix. Now, from my parochial self-interest as a scientist involved in energy research, that's good for me, okay? It means that one of the few unopposed priorities within recent policy debates has been government support of science and technology, which holds promise for clean and sustainable energy. But while I do think that it is useful and appropriate to do research in energy, and I've done it most of my career, I'm very concerned about the unrealistic expectations that our society has for future technology. And this is really based on nothing very complicated. It's based on simple arithmetic applied to the global situation. I mean, right now, the average per capita energy consumption of the world is less than 1/5 of the US per capita energy consumption rate. So if a global population of 6 or 7 billion, optimistically, were to achieve the rate of consumption of energy of the US, it would therefore require 5 times as much global consumption as we have at present. And such a consumption would not be sustainable, even if by some extraordinary and unexpected breakthrough, we were able to replace all but 10% of the fossil fuels that we currently use with non-emitting sources. Even the most ambitious and unrealistic of political hopes, for example, to replace all but 20% of US fossil energy with sustainable forms by 2050, is not nearly enough to solve the energy problem. It would not lead of itself to a sustainable global energy scenario compatible with the basic aspirations of humanity as expressed in those terms. Something has to give. In this sense, there is simply no technological fix for energy. But it's worse even than that. Every technological innovation of significant scope has unintended consequences. Technological developments are always double-edged, or perhaps I think it would be more appropriate to say multiple-edged. The side effects, or even the direct effects, are themselves the cause of new technologies, of new challenges. It's not just that technology can be used for good or ill. It's commonplace for nuclear technology to be understood in this good or ill way. The enormous energy stored in the nuclear force can be released by our scientific knowledge and directed by the technologies that it has spawned. Nuclear energy's association with nuclear weapons, which was the first application of nuclear fission, has understandably led to deep suspicion and often irrational fear. Nuclear technology is widely recognized as double-edged, and many consider that a reason to forswear it. The problem with the nuclear example, though, is that the terrifying prospect of nuclear weapons makes it seem that nuclear is a special case, but it isn't. Every powerful technology, however seemingly benign, is double or multiple-edged. Even the good effects themselves may lead to new challenges, and they are almost always accompanied by unintended consequences. Take as an example the health benefits that result from the understanding of the causes of disease. The demonstration by Louis Pasteur that came in the mid-19th century that a whole spectrum of diseases and decay arise from germs rather than from spontaneous generation led to new strategies of public health and disease prevention and treatment that eventually have transformed the survival prospects of humans in the West. And Dr. Kilpatrick showed many graphs illustrating that this morning. Mortality rates have dropped dramatically and much suffering has been obviated. As a result of this, and of other technical and social developments, which resulted in increased food supplies, the population of England, for example, quadrupled during the 19th century. The population growth and the growth of consumption that accompanies it is in fact the primary cause of the adverse environmental impacts in the form of urbanization, pollution, and deforestation. Thus, the environmental challenges of today can be thought of as a direct result of past technological development. And the problems, and this is the main point, the problems arise not from the failures of unnecessary technologies, but from the successes of technologies devoted to the most basic human needs of food and sanitation and hygiene, and so on. So every technological solution leads to new technological problems. Often, the new problems appear to be greater than the old ones. And if this is so, then we have a vicious spiral in which ever greater technological resources are chasing ever-growing technological problems, with the new solutions leading to even greater challenges. Each fix just winds the spiral higher into greater problems. And just as the successes of health technologies have led to greater problems, so the successes of energy technologies of every kind have provided the ability to affect the environment ever more powerfully, and ever more difficult challenges have arisen. It reminds one of the old woman who swallowed the spider to catch the fly. The escalation of hoped-for fixes is a frequent story with technology. It's not clear that we've yet quite reached the point of trying to swallow the horse, but we're getting closer all the time. Now, this pessimistic scenario is not preordained. If you were to think in terms of a mathematical analysis of the dynamics of the system, what I have described is what we would call an unstable or diverging situation with ever-increasing demand. But it's also possible that there might be a stable or converging situation where the new problems caused by each fix are actually smaller than the prior problems. And if that's the case, the system will soon stabilize and the perturbations will die away. Unfortunately, though, there's no sign that technological fixes lead to stable solutions for society as a whole. And what's more, economists have spent 100 years or more proclaiming that growth, which is the unstable case, is good. Indeed, their doctrine is, and we've heard it throughout the recent political campaign, that economic growth is the most important goal that government ought to promote. That seems to me a problem. If there's no technological fix, there are nevertheless ways forward, I believe, to a sustainable future. For those of us who are Christians, we do not set our ultimate sights in this world. Yet, this world is God's creation, and we're charged with the stewardship of it. And I believe that to ignore the environmental and global challenges that are made so pressing by technology is to ignore a responsibility placed on us by God. It doesn't seem to me acceptable for the Christian community as a whole, even if it is for certain individuals, to say, well, the Lord is coming soon, so we should set aside the care of this world in order to promote attention to the next. And I think that's, of course, why we're meeting in this symposium this weekend. Indeed, it seems to me, on the contrary, that it is precisely through the interface between the world of nature and the world of the spirit that the real opportunity for sustainability lies. And it seems to me that the most debilitating effects of scientism in this discussion are precisely those which undermine the importance of non-scientific and ultimately spiritual considerations. What I mean is this: the problem of technopoly and of the resulting environmental crisis can only be addressed, I believe, by attention to values. In essence, the problem of environmental sustainability is that the world has too many people wanting too much stuff. Technology cannot fix that. And more often than not, it makes the problems worse because of the additional power that it provides. A sustainable world is one in which the reasonable aspirations are not for the lifestyles of the rich and famous, or indeed of the developed West, but for a globally middle-class economic level characterized by bicycles, buses, nourishing food, adequate housing, and communications. For the West, such a sustainable future will certainly mean reduced consumption, but it need not mean a less satisfying life. It will require a change of values away from the consumer-driven culture. Values are not provided by technology or science. The types of changes we most need to achieve sustainable are not technological. Now, I don't mean to say that there are no technological improvements. Of course not. And I don't mean to say that they're useless. Technological improvements can be very beneficial, and the science that enables them is worthwhile. It's just that those technological benefits are insufficient of themselves and may serve as a distraction from more fundamental issues. Not all the important solutions are technological. Many of the most intractable challenges of society are not technical, they're human and moral. Technology is of little use for those challenges. Just as it is an erroneous scientism, which supposes that all the real knowledge there is science, it's an erroneous technocentrism, which supposes that all the efficacious solutions to our challenges are technological. But the one error leads to the other. The search for the technological fix follows, in a certain sense, from the scientific worldview. Science and technology do not provide us with moral values, but they are not, because of that, safely value neutral. When scientism's monopolizing tendencies artificially raise science onto a pedestal beyond the wider human, personal, and intellectual endeavor of which it is a part, or when the compulsions of technopoly overwhelm the traditions and restraints of the wider culture, then they are usurping the culture's value. They are being set up as values in themselves and values beyond the prerogative of the rest of society. Here, though, and I come back to the comment I made earlier, this is where I think Postman's, and indeed humanism's, cultural resources are insufficient, but where I think Christianity has immense resources. The scientific individualism of today's Western society, however enlightened by cultural breadth in the way that Postman advocates, doesn't provide compelling moral warrant for altruism of any sort, let alone for a moderation of the will to technological power and technological development. We can see around us daily the moral poverty of radical individualism in our academic institutions. The desperate attempt, for example, to justify earthkeeping by appeals to diversity, as if that was some self-justifying moral good that we can deduce from evolutionary considerations. That, I submit, is a sign of the poverty of an ethical outlook that has no grounding. Not that there isn't value in diversity in many situations, there often is, but that it simply cannot bear the moral weight that it is being asked to sustain. We have tough decisions in front of us about technology, all the more difficult because of global human competition. If we are to make those decisions deliberately, rather than by default of action, we need moral principles that are really robust, the sort of principles, I'd suggest, that historically have arisen from religion. We need to see those moral values as more than arbitrary personal choices or evolutionary accidents. They need to be compelling, and even, if I allow myself to be exquisitely countercultural, they even have to be binding. without a transcendent ethics based on what we take to be truth, not just on what is pragmatic, I don't see how those decisions are going to be taken. So that's one kind of spiritual resource in tackling technopoly. Another is that the scriptures themselves provide specific insights that directly apply to our challenges. Yet often, our society, even with the unquestioning support of Christians, is organized in opposition to those scriptural insights. Wanting too much stuff, the Bible calls covetousness. Yet when we give control of the most powerful communications media to commercial and advertising interests, we are handing over our main tool for shaping society's opinions and actions to covetousness. Technology can give us stuff. It can give us enormously clever, entertaining, and powerful stuff. Is that really our highest value? If it isn't, then how do we redirect the energies of our society to affirm the values that we Christians, say we believe in? So let me come to my conclusion. Technopoly is the target of a great deal of cultural criticism. Yet most criticism appears almost powerless to divert the course of technological dominance. There are many reasons for this apparent inability to resist the technological imperative. And actually, we had a very thoughtful discussion of that in our plenary talk last night. And I'm sure there are many other thoughtful evaluations of the direction of technology that are being presented as part of this conference, and many analyses of the effects that make technopoly so intractable. But what I've tried to show is that scientism, the belief that science is all there is of real knowledge, is in a certain sense the epistemological sibling of technopoly. They grew up together, they're mutually supportive, they each provide a large part of the intellectual and commercial justification of the other, and they are alike also in being improper extrapolations of successful human technical endeavor into monopolistic dominance. Perhaps because I'm a scientist, I value highly the insight and truth that the natural sciences provide. But perhaps because I'm a Christian, I see that scientism is a metaphysical leap not justified by science, or indeed, I would say, by anything else. And it's my hope that by understanding and detailing the distinction between science and scientism, individuals and society can find ways to value the science while rejecting the scientism. It's also my hope and belief that this distinction and this rejection can serve to weaken technopoly to the point where moral and not just pragmatic decision-making about technology becomes feasible. Thank you very much.
This session runs till 3, so we have quite a bit of time for questions. Dr. Hutchinson raised many interesting issues, and I'm sure we brought up thoughts and questions. First question.
We've got to fix the technology first.
I can talk pretty loudly. Can you give us some examples of how you incorporate Christian values with your own research in nuclear energy?
Yes, I think that Christian values at the individual level, I think that's what you're asking, can be very important in helping to guide and shape a person's career, their career choices, their choice of topics in research, and so on. Certainly, I have been blessed with opportunities which I have sought to do research in areas where I think the potential great potential exists for the benefit of humankind. I've also, on occasions, for example, taken the pledge not to pursue research opportunities in areas which I considered to be counterproductive. So, for example, in the 1980s, the Star Wars initiative, the Ballistic Missile Defense Initiative, was an initiative which I considered was unwise, unworkable, and inappropriate, and I refused, despite the fact that my discipline was very important to trying to realize that, I declined to pursue that kind of research. So that's an example. So there are many individual examples that one can think of. I think that's what you were asking for. Yeah.
This is a little bit of a nitpick, but when you were talking about technology not being value neutral, you said they too often usurp values or they're seen as values in themselves. But both of those are, well, the first one is ascribing agency to the technology. The second one is pointing to the act of humans of seeing in a certain way. And I want to applaud everything you said, especially emphasizing the need for us to take responsibility for restraint. But I don't know if you want to speak to that or.
Okay, so is it a little bit self-contradictory to say, to argue that science and technology are not value neutral, and then, but I think in the end, you probably gained the point of what I'm saying, is that very often science and technology are being put forward as if they were value neutral. In other words, it's sometimes said that technology is value neutral. It's what we do with it, It's what humans do with it that determines its value. I actually don't think that's the case. I would not affirm that. I think very often technologies have built-in values, and there have been some very interesting talks. For example, this morning we were talking about online instruction and the extent to which the internet itself brings to bear a certain kind of value into the educational endeavor. I wanted to say even more than that. I wanted to say that what has actually begun to happen is that scientism and technopoly are being set up as a kinds of values in themselves. They're kind of abstract values. And so in the case of scientism, it's being set up as if science is all the knowledge there is, and well, of course, knowledge is good, and so that's good. And in the case of technology, technopoly, the thing that strikes me most is how often I hear, in the circles in which I move, of innovation being spoken as if it is a self-evident good. I mean, it's not obvious to me that doing something differently is necessarily doing it better. And so this notion that innovation is, of course, good seems to me open to question. But yet that's an example of a kind of technopoly being set up as a value in itself. And that's what I was trying to draw attention to. Thank you.
Again, a great talk. What if, getting to the point where someone like Ray Kurzweil or Kevin Kelly, I don't know if you've read his book, it's called What Technology Wants. Ray Kurzweil and some of his comments in the Singularity Institute, that and they really don't care what people think. That this is really something about creating God. I think even Kurzweil says that in some of his lines, that he is God, he is creating this. Or Kevin Kelly, in his title of his book, What Technology Wants, he starts to say this actually is God being created. How then does your last line there work? That, if you heard my question last night, if people are being much reduced in value economically through our system, they're not as productive, being replaced, that there are those, maybe the Singularity Institute, if you're familiar with that out in California, that in an article in June of 2010, New York Times, about the Singularity Institute, talked about Richard Clark, Judeo-Christian people may become a threat to this technological progress. In fact, they need to be watched as potential terrorists. But what happens if it gets to the point where they don't really care what we think?
I'm not familiar with the other writer that you spoke about, but I do know a little bit about Kurzweil. Certainly he is a person who is, in a certain sense, comfortable with technopoly. He basically says, yes, it's happening. Let's go with the flow. Sit back and enjoy it. And I think that's approximately what you were alluding to. It is remarkable that Neil Postman uses this expression, freedom fighters, for those who are going to oppose technopoly. I do think that there is a sense in which there will be a cultural confrontation. I think if anyone in the society tries to oppose technological development, technological deployment, they are very, very often sidelined or criticized. They're labeled as being Luddites. They're labeled as being, some kind of extreme person who is out of touch with reality. But I think that really just points out how difficult, how intractable this situation really is. I didn't say a great deal about this in general, but I think one of the things which makes it so intractable is the rivalries that exist not only within a particular society, but between societies. So it would be very hard for the US to imagine foregoing some powerful technology if we knew that the Chinese were going to adopt it and we were going to lose out in a resulting competition. I mean, that's the power of technopoly. It seems to me inevitable. And certainly in competitive situations, technologies which provide competitive examples are things which are very hard for us to set aside. But perhaps there's a way in which, in a globalized society, in a truly global society, we can reach the point where we begin to agree upon certain restraints. And in my own field, I mean, in the field of nuclear technology, in respect of weapons, at any rate, it's a remarkable fact that for all of our fears and justifiable fears and concerns about nuclear weaponry, nuclear weapons have not been used for 60 years, and they have, in a certain sense, maintained a global peace, albeit with many more localized and undoubtedly vicious and painful and shocking wars. So, I think that that's perhaps a sign that there is some reason to believe that we can eschew the uses of some types of technology. But I don't want to be excessively optimistic about this, because I think I see the intractability of technopoly. The other thing to say is that Christians in general are counterculturalists. I mean, whether we like it or not, Christianity grew up as a strange and practically invisible sect within the Roman Empire. And it was only by part of what must be God's plan that it ever came to be, Christendom and so on and so forth. And conceivably, we will go back to being seen as being profoundly countercultural in respect of technology as well as in other respects. The Amish example is an example which I think is salutary of people who have taken a moral and spiritual decision not to adopt certain types of technology, and as a result are seen by our society, including most of us here, as being strange and countercultural. I think that may be inevitable, maybe not very comfortable either.
I have a question I'd like to add on to that, in particular with some of the news that's come out in the last week. How do we as Christians try to promote moral interpretation and limits on technology to the pluralistic world? An example, even within the last week, there's been announcements that both in the United States and Britain, genetic engineering has worked out that it can actually lead to alteration of genetic information passed through generations, not just a single individual that passed on. How do we try to have a Christian voice?
Golly, that's a tough question. I don't know the answer. I think that we need to get to the point where we say our values are not based on pragmatism. Our values are not based on some kind of extrapolation of science, of evolutionary fittedness, and so on and so forth. And it has to be, I believe, we have to take those stands on the basis of what are ultimately spiritual values and not merely pragmatic values. But of course, again, that is profoundly countercultural, even within the U.S. And so to do that, I think, is going to take a great deal of courage and thought and seriousness, and it's not going to make us popular. But I'm not a biologist. I'm not a geneticist. I'm going to leave that problem to them. I have enough of my own problems. Let them sort those out.
There are two of us here, and we just discovered each other as being lovers of C.S. Lewis, and we're both afraid to come up here on our own because we are shaking like a leaf in front of someone who knows science so well from the inside. So I guess we're going to venture a question here in regards to clarifying to what extent C.S. Lewis was confusing science with scientism. And I'm going to read you a quote from C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. I'd like your response to it.
Great.
He writes, "The regenerate science which I have in mind would not even do to minerals and vegetables what modern science threatens to do to man himself. When it explained, it would not explain away. When it spoke of the parts, it would remember the whole. While studying the it would not lose what Martin Buber calls the thou situation."
It seems to me that this quote and the whole principle seems to be, anti-scientism rather than anti-science, because it seems like he's still valuing science as a good and wholesome thing, thus the misappropriation of it. And if you go back to your space trilogy as well, which is an amazing, amazing, amazing series, he has Weston, be the evil, genius or whatever who creates the orb ship and wants to take over. But I think what he's criticizing is the philosophy rather than the science itself. So.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that question. I had a private bet with myself that if I made a comment about C.S. Lewis that was in any sense slightly critical, I'd get some comeback. Okay. And I didn't, and I'm glad that I wasn't disappointed, but I don't want to make a joke out of your comment. Again, I affirm that I am C.S. Lewis's biggest fan in this room, okay? But that doesn't mean that I think that he was always as clear or as correct as he should have been. Now, your quote talks about this redeemed science, which takes into account the big picture as well as the little picture. I just think that's a misunderstanding of the way science works. Science works by analyzing the world and focuses on the way in which it behaves in these reproducible and ways that we can measure and we can quantify. That's, to me, what science is. And of course, I mean natural science. Now, if C.S. Lewis talks about some grander, bigger picture science, he doesn't mean natural science. He means a bigger picture of knowledge, okay? And I think it's confusing to speak in those terms these days. This confusion arises because once upon a time, the word science could be understood by reference to its Latin derivation, scientia. It simply meant knowledge. So once upon a time, science simply meant knowledge. if that's what you mean by science, then scientism is not only true, it's a tautology, because all of real knowledge is science, okay? But that's not what we mean by science today. It might have been nearer to what we meant by science when Lewis wrote that, okay? But for today, we don't mean science by that. When we use the unqualified word science, we almost always are referring to natural sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, geology, and so on. And if you have that meaning of the word science, then I think it is confusing, at least, to speak in the way that Lewis often does. And that's the reason why I have tried to emphasize this word scientism as a valuable kind of portmanteau word to describe the confusion that arises in terms of, which is fed often by these conflicting usages of the word science. That I define in the way that I did. So that's sort of my comeback. Again, Lewis did indict scientism, no question about it, but very often did not draw clear distinctions, in my opinion, between science, and I mean natural science, and scientism, which is, I believe, an improper extrapolation of it.
Could you take that as being more in context with something like, say, natural philosophy rather than science in the modern
Sure,
definition
absolutely.
of the term?
What I mean by science was once called natural philosophy. Okay, but that's what everyone means when they these days when they just say science unqualified. I mean, of course, we have political science, but that's not science. It's not natural science. Okay, we have social science, but that's not science either. They use different approaches to understanding. And they are examples of what I would call non-scientific knowledge. Now, the use of the word science that's associated with those is, of course, in part a reflection of this archaic meaning of the word science, and it's also in part an attempt to grab some brand loyalty and promote their viewpoint that, well, we actually are turning sociology into a science. So it is actually a sign also of a kind of positivistic trend in much of the social disciplines, for example.
I think all of us, either implicitly or explicitly, understand the danger and would want to act against monopoly and a little technicism. And that being the case, then we have to ask ourselves, why aren't we moving in a more redemptive direction? Could it be that technology has stripped us of our consciousness and our morals? As one woman said where I spoke in a group, son, you have to understand that nobody is going to take away my television. I think that the technopoly offers us rewards such that we do calculations, something like this. Well, yeah, it really does have to change. And especially in the technicism of money and how money operates in our culture, we have to make some changes. But for me to go out and do something about it in a positive direction with other people is just too costly. Besides, I might risk the beautiful benefits of an air-conditioned room with lighting, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think you're right to a large extent, and I do believe that it is in the end difficult and maybe even futile for individuals to imagine that they can solve or contribute to the problem by isolated actions rather than by concerted social actions. What I have in mind is the notion that somehow we will solve, let's say, the problems of excessive gasoline consumption by all individuals, getting to the point where they're going to buy, Prius hybrids or something. I think my own view is rather pessimistic about whether that is likely to have any success value. On the other hand, Europe routinely uses far less gasoline per mile of traveled than the United States for perfectly straightforward economic and social reasons, because they tax gasoline much higher than we do. In other words, that's a social action, a concerted social action, as opposed to an individual action. So I believe that if we're going to have any impact on technopoly as a whole, it's not just going to be the fact that I don't do Facebook. I don't, actually. But it's going to be also, it's going to come about through concerted action, where I not only don't do Facebook, but I give people very good reasons why I don't do Facebook, and maybe even persuade them that there's something in what that guy says, you know? So maybe that leads to some concerted action. But I think you've brought forth a very important point, and it's very intractable.
Thank you again for a great talk. I was thinking about your vicious cycle of the growing technology creating the growing problem. I wonder if that doesn't suggest a strategy to us that we engage in what this technology might lead to, and in that discussion early, because many technology critics I hear from say, just say no to technology. In so doing, they're not influencing the impact of that technology in our society by saying no. You have to build the argument. So I wonder if that diagram might not be helpful in this direction.
You may be right. I think it's very hard to predict the unpredictable. So figuring out what the unpredictable consequences are is hard. But I certainly think we should do it. And I certainly think that there are certain areas where this is done in engineering and design, but not with the deliberateness that perhaps we need to. But thank you for that comment. Yeah.
Following up with your positive feedback loop and thinking about it in the context of good technology, like your example of clean water and abundant food, like that. So it seemed like the feed-forward spiral problems and then the requisite technology are going to get bigger and bigger. Is that something we have to live with as Christians, looking at we're doing things with this technology? Or does it give us a sense of discernment when we see these problems? We need to take some time and think about alternatives, which might delay some kind of solution to really pressing need. I'm just curious of your thoughts about that.
I mean, to be honest, I don't know the answer. The fact that Elul gives no prospects for a solution or no ideas for a solution is a sign of how intractable this problem really is. I mean, Postman's ideas, I think, are interesting and worth talking about, but I think they're insufficient, as I said. And I think that from the point of view of Christians, the most important thing that we can do is to bring our Christian values to bear on the question, which we've been extremely reticent, as far as I can tell, to do. Because after all, America is this strange country. Sorry, this may seem like a critique from an outsider. I am actually a citizen these days, but America is a strange country from that point of view. We have the most widespread Christian roots and Christian commitments amongst our population, but on the other of any of the developed nations. But on the other hand, we're the first to adopt the new fancy new technologies, and what's more, Christians are at the forefront of adopting those new technologies as forcefully and as quickly as everyone else. So there isn't any sign so far that, with these exceptions of groups like the Amish, that we as Christians have a mechanism of distancing or separating ourselves from the thrust of the society as a whole when it comes to the question of technology. So it's a tough one. It's a tough one. Here's the question.
This relates to your observation relative to diversity. I didn't actually hear if it was bio or social diversity, but I sometimes tell my students that one of the ironies of 1968, 1969 was that with technology that seems really ancient by today's standards, we put men on the moon in 1969 at the same time that there were riots in the street and war in Vietnam. So I agree with you. Simply establishing a diversity office, it does stuff, I guess, but it doesn't close the problem. Is there a way, in your view, where technology can actually address that, or how, from the Christian perspective, it seems kind of obvious to me, but how would you say from the Christian perspective we can address those matters?
Well, thank you for that question. Certainly, I believe that within society as a whole, there is enormous benefit in listening to other people's point of view. And that applies in all aspects of diversity, whether it be racial or ethnic or other types of differences of viewpoint. The problem is that what I was trying to get at in the comment that I made was that diversity as a concept is being overloaded because we don't have within our modern academy grounded moral and ethical values, grounded in some traditional viewpoints or religious viewpoints. We are casting around for other bases on which to justify our ethics. And I think there's a sense in which, as a result of that, we're in danger of undermining the moral forces that drove the reformers of the 60s, for example, Martin Luther King. You know, it's commonplace for, I get into these debates with atheists more often than I ought to, but, you know, it's commonplace for atheists to say, you know, that the racial emancipation for which Martin Luther King fought had nothing to do with his religion. What utter nonsense, okay? He was driven by his Christian principles. And so it isn't that we can support our moral principles on the principle of diversity. It's actually the other way around. The diversity is to be supported by our Christian principles. And that's what it was historically. But so thank you for that important point. Yeah.
You mentioned the importance of kind of redefining the technopoly, and how you do that is through changing value systems, and especially bringing Christian values in kind of a broader scale. But at the same time, within a plural nation, obviously there are tons of different sets of value systems, and to assume that we could take America back to its Christian roots is obviously a difficult path to take, an assumption to make, as great as it may be or may not be. Who do you see as Christianity's greatest ally in this struggle, and what other groups or belief structures do you think we could use to assist us in working through the problems that come along with monopoly?
Okay, clearly we are a pluralistic society, and there are no prospects of us becoming something other than a pluralistic society in the near future. So yes, I'm not advocating some monopolistic Christian, kingdom of Christianity in our nation. But on this question of who are our natural allies, actually, in certain areas, particularly in areas relating to the environment and so forth, there are many natural allies. The difficulty is that those allies very often have their own agenda, and they often don't understand what the value structures and authority structures of the people who are coming from a religious perspective are. But there were initiatives in the late 80s where various scientific environmental groups would reach out to religious groups and say, look, those guys out there have the attention of half the nation every Sunday. We should recruit them to be part of our push to have a more sustainable society and that kind of thing. So the difficulty, of course, is that they did so with very little respect for our religious or the Christian religious and ethical principles. So my answer is there are many areas of common interest which we ought to forge, and we certainly shouldn't go into this, and I think this is the point you're getting at, we shouldn't go into this with some kind of exclusivist viewpoint, and there may be people who will join forces with us even though they're motivated from different viewpoints. But I think that what we have to insist upon, or we should insist upon, let's say, is that our ethical values based on our beliefs, our religious beliefs, are at least as meaningful and as valuable and as important as any other of the secular ones within the academy. So I don't even think we're even kind of at that level in much of society. It's very often we're in this ABC situation, anything but Christianity, right? Thank you for that question.